Et je voudrais très rapidement organiser la parole des uns et des autres, mais d'abord, évidemment, saluer nos orateurs, Evelyn Erskines, monsieur qui s'occupe des objectifs du millénaire, monsieur le secrétaire général des Nations Unies sortant, monsieur Kofi Annan, monsieur le maire de Rome, notre hôte, madame Sentinelli, ministre, et monsieur Manservisi pour la Commission européenne. Vous m'avez fait l'honneur, monsieur le maire, de me proposer de modérer ce débat. Nous n'avons pas beaucoup de temps, nous avons 1 heure, alors il faudra que nous soyons tous très sévères avec le temps. Je ne peux pas ne pas dire, monsieur le maire, et je parle sans le contrôle de mon président, le maire de Paris, Bertrand Delanoë, que vous avez la plus belle mairie du monde. Et je suis toujours émue d'être ici, que ce soit à cause du musée et de ses merveilles, que ce soit à cause de la terrasse où on voit les splendeurs de Rome, ou à cause de la salle des Horaces, où on a signé le traité de Rome, au moment où les chefs d'État sont réunis pour peut-être sauver ce qui reste de constitution européenne. Alors, je crois que, sans plus attendre, je voudrais proposer à monsieur le maire de Rome de dire, d'intervenir tout de suite.
Tutti gli uomini sono dentro una indistricabile rete di reciprocità, sono legati da un destino che ha per tutti la stessa trama, qualsiasi cosa tocchi direttamente uno, tocca indirettamente tutti. Queste parole che il reverendo Martin Luther King rivolse al suo popolo per spiegare l'insostenibilità storica della discriminazione razziale mi tornano alla mente ogni volta che si parla di povertà e di fame. Ogni volta che l'ambiente si incarica di dirci che non riesce più a sostenere uno sviluppo senza giusti limiti, ogni volta che il pensiero va ai bambini del mondo senza cibo e senza acqua, senza istruzione, senza le medicine che potrebbero curare la loro malattia, senza più i loro genitori portati via dall'AIDS. Nel messaggio del profeta dei neri americani c'era, oltre che il freddo riconoscimento di un fatto, il calore di una grande speranza che neppure il suo assassinio avrebbe spento. Oggi le ragioni della speranza sembrano essere meno forti. Anche chi le conserva, chi le nutra e le cura nel proprio cuore, anche chi dà magari la vita per farle rinascere, è obbligato a scendere sul duro terreno delle cose. Fatti, non sentimenti, come dicono quelli che ritengono di saper vivere a dispetto dei sogni e delle utopie. E i fatti, siamo qui a Roma per dirlo con tutta la forza che ci è concessa, non ammettono più alcuna scusa. I fatti ci consegnano una precisa realtà. Se tutto continuerà ad andare come in questi ultimi 7 anni, nessun singolo obiettivo del millennio sarà raggiunto appieno entro il 2015. Se le cose non cambieranno in fretta, se non cambieranno subito, gli impegni presi nel 2000 da 189 capi di Stato e di Governo rimarranno poco più che semplici parole, che alla fine perderanno anche la loro bellezza, quella che peraltro non manca in tanti altri documenti, e diventeranno solo la testimonianza della nostra incapacità e del nostro fallimento. In fondo della nostra poca saggezza. Perché non è solo giusto, non è solo la coscienza del mondo che lo chiede. Non c'è nulla, in verità, di più saggio e di più realistico per i paesi ricchi che rispettare e rendere concreti gli impegni presi nella dichiarazione del millennio. Realistico, perché quando la povertà, le emergenze sanitarie e i conflitti giungono alle dimensioni che oggi hanno raggiunto, è impensabile che restino circoscritti, che restino separati, che restino lontani. Niente può fermare i disperati che si mettono in viaggio costretti dalla fame propria e dei propri figli, né un giovane che sa che se rimarrà nel suo paese avrà molte probabilità di non arrivare neppure a 40 anni. Ed è illusorio pensare di svuotare il mare in cui pescano il fondamentalismo ed altri estremismi, finché ci saranno disuguaglianze che gridano vendetta nel cielo. Ci sono nel mondo 854 milioni di persone che sono sottoalimentate, che soffrono la fame. Ce lo dice la FAO ed è il primo degli obiettivi del millennio che si allontana. E soprattutto sono 854 milioni di individui, di esseri umani, che continuano a restare ogni giorno sospesi tra la vita e la morte. Resta un miraggio anche l'obiettivo di ridurre drasticamente dei 2/3 rispetto al 1990 il tasso di mortalità infantile. Solo la mancanza di acqua potabile uccide, secondo l'UNICEF, oltre 1,5 milioni di bambini l'anno. 1,5 milioni di bambini l'anno. E anche qui c'è chi tra i poveri è ancora più povero, perché la stragrande maggioranza dei paesi che soffrono di questa mancanza appartiene all'area dell'Africa subsahariana. Il risultato di questo, delle guerre, delle malattie, dell'insufficiente volontà della comunità internazionale, è che su 1.000 bambini africani nati quest'anno, 175 moriranno entro il 2012, ovvero prima del compimento del loro 5º anno d'età. È il destino che riguarda ogni anno nei paesi in via di sviluppo 11 milioni di bambini della stessa età. E se allarghiamo lo sguardo, vediamo 120 milioni di bambini che non sanno cosa sia un'aula scolastica. Vediamo che dei 40 milioni di individui colpiti dal virus dell'HIV, 25 milioni vivono in Africa. Vediamo oltre 500.000 donne che ogni anno muoiono durante il parto. E anche qui la disparità delle condizioni è gigantesca. Quello che per fortuna negli Stati Uniti avviene ad una partoriente su 3.700, nei paesi del sud del mondo riguarda una donna su 16. La lista del che fare per cambiare questo insopportabile stato di cose è lunga e complicata e riguarda l'agenda del mondo per i prossimi decenni. Ma le ricette e le soluzioni ci sono scritte ad esempio nel Millennium Project, curato per le Nazioni Unite proprio dal professore Jeffrey Sachs. Sono contenute nello stesso rapporto della Commission for Africa di 2 anni fa. Non c'è molto altro da studiare, da analizzare, da inserire in qualche nuova statistica. Quello che serve è la volontà di passare dalle promesse ai fatti. Sono il coraggio e la determinazione che, ad essere sinceri, non abbiamo visto nella misura dovuta nemmeno nell'ultimo vertice del G8 in Germania. E pensare che alcune misure sono davvero a portata di mano, sono relativamente semplici e rappresenterebbero, una volta adottate, una svolta epocale. Dopo l'11 settembre si trovarono 200 miliardi di dollari per la lotta contro il terrorismo. Giustissimo. Ma è possibile che nel frattempo i governi, nonostante gli accorati appelli rivolti per anni dal segretario generale Kofi Annan, non siano riusciti a trovare un 20° di quella somma per contrastare efficacemente l'AIDS nel continente africano? Ed è possibile che non si riesca a fare in modo di escludere i diritti di proprietà intellettuale e la brevettabilità di farmaci che, se usati liberamente, potrebbero salvare milioni di persone non solo dall'AIDS, ma anche da altre malattie? La verità è che il sud del mondo continua a soffrire gli effetti di una globalizzazione che, così come è ingiusta, perché impone svantaggi e disuguaglianze più che distribuire opportunità. Negli ultimi 40 anni il reddito medio dei paesi più poveri è cresciuto da 212 a 267 dollari, mentre quello dei paesi ricchi si è quasi triplicato da 11.400 a 32.000 dollari. Oggi le somme e i beni posseduti dai primi 3 esseri umani più ricchi sono maggiori del PIL dei 49 paesi meno sviluppati, che contano 600 milioni di abitanti, 3 persone contro 600 milioni. Può reggere a lungo un divario così dirompente? Evidentemente no, eppure quasi nessuno dei paesi ricchi ha rispettato l'impegno di destinare ad aiuti allo sviluppo almeno lo 0,7 del proprio PIL. È un obiettivo che resta lontano, come resta lontana la cancellazione effettiva e completa del debito dei paesi poveri. Il mio paese, l'Italia, nonostante un aumento dei fondi destinati alla cooperazione, resta, in base ai dati OCSE, agli ultimi posti tra i paesi ricchi per percentuale di PIL destinata agli aiuti allo sviluppo, con uno 0,2 che scende allo 0,1 al netto della cancellazione del debito. Siamo distanti non solo dallo 0,7 ma anche dalla tappa intermedia dello 0,33 che, secondo gli impegni europei di Barcellona, avremmo dovuto raggiungere l'anno scorso. Vanno in una direzione positiva gli impegni assunti dal Presidente Prodi in occasione dell'ultimo G8 in Germania. Questi dunque sono i fatti, sono un muro, un recinto dentro il quale ci siamo tutti, noi che viviamo nella parte giusta del mondo, dimenticando troppo spesso di essere una minoranza. Dobbiamo abbattere quel muro e aprire quel recinto. I paesi e le popolazioni del sud del mondo chiedono giustamente di essere messe in grado di determinare il proprio futuro, chiedono di essere aiutate ad aiutarsi, di essere messe nelle condizioni di scegliere appropriate politiche di sviluppo. Per questo servono regole e meccanismi decisionali alla base degli scambi commerciali, serve abbattere le barriere doganali, servono la cancellazione del debito, il rispetto della sostenibilità ambientale e l'inclusione di clausole sociali equilibrate e realistiche negli accordi economici siglati con i paesi in via di sviluppo. Io credo che compiti importanti di fronte agli scenari che davanti ai nostri occhi si modificano radicalmente e velocemente spettino proprio alle città, ai governi locali. Nessuna sostituzione, ovviamente, non è possibile e non è auspicabile. Bisogna piuttosto procedere insieme, unendo tutte le forze, a cominciare dall'Unione Europea, che ha il merito di avere appena riconosciuto il ruolo degli enti locali come attori per le politiche di sviluppo. Nel mondo globalizzato serve una politica alta e su larga scala, che al tempo stesso non perda le radici a livello locale. Il mondo ha bisogno di relazioni, ha bisogno di dialogo, di stabilire legami che facilitino conoscenza e scambio, ha bisogno di cooperazione. A volte tutto questo è più facile e possibile proprio quando a muoversi, a parlare tra loro sono, come oggi facciamo, le città. Per questo sono lieto che tante città del mondo siano rappresentate qui, oggi, a dire che accettano di sentirsi dentro quella indistricabile rete di reciprocità di cui parlava Martin Luther King, ad affermare l'esistenza di un terreno comune, di obiettivi comuni per i quali lavorare. Anche perché chi ogni giorno ha il compito di amministrare una grande metropoli sa bene quanto sia vera la considerazione fatta qualche tempo fa da Mr. Kofi Annan. La povertà del mondo ha ormai un epicentro che si sta spostando proprio qui, dalle campagne alle città, cito tra virgolette, ed è uno spostamento riconoscibile come l'urbanizzazione della povertà. È nelle città, in questo tempo di enormi cambiamenti, che si decide molto dello scontro tra il valore della sicurezza e quello della libertà, tra l'inclinazione degli uomini verso il rinnovamento e la loro paura dei mutamenti, tra la ricchezza del melting pot e la diffidenza verso ciò che appare estraneo, tra i processi di disgregazione e quelli di integrazione. Ecco l'importanza di un'alleanza, di un network, di una vera e propria rete per collegare chi, come le città e i governi locali uniti, crede alla possibilità di costruire una nuova governance su scala globale, crede al ruolo della cooperazione internazionale per unire le energie delle città più forti a quelle delle città che vogliono crescere in un modo più equilibrato, crede all'opportunità che anche in questo modo si possano raggiungere gli obiettivi della dichiarazione del Millennium, riaffermati e diffusi in questi anni dalla Millennium Campaign. Ed ecco allo stesso modo l'importanza della ricerca del dialogo tra i popoli e le religioni, tra le vite, i sentimenti e le speranze che si intrecciano all'interno delle nostre comunità, non in modo astratto, ma nelle vie, nelle piazze, nei luoghi di lavoro, nelle scuole dove studiano e crescono, abituandosi a vivere insieme, ragazzi che un giorno riusciranno a portare a termine quello che noi siamo solo riusciti ad avviare. Dobbiamo fare in modo che il testimone che consegneremo loro arrivi il più avanti possibile, che faccia un tratto di strada importante a cominciare dal raggiungimento degli obiettivi di sviluppo del millennio. Questo è il messaggio che vorremmo arrivasse oggi da Roma, che su tutti questi fronti si sente impegnata ogni giorno, perché questa è la sua convinzione, questa è la volontà che anima la sua attività, questa è la sua stessa identità. È una sfida difficile e ardua, ma la civiltà globalizzata del terzo millennio ha la ricchezza, le conoscenze e i mezzi necessari, per cui sarebbe una colpa imperdonabile venire meno a quest'obbligo. Riusciranno i nostri figli, se terremo viva la speranza e se otterremo sin d'ora quei risultati concreti che siamo stati capaci di individuare, di scrivere nei nostri documenti, ma non ancora di raggiungere. Riusciremo se saremo davvero convinti che i grandi cambiamenti iniziano dalle piccole cose, che il cammino più lungo è inizio con un passo, al quale segue un altro e un altro ancora. E così un giorno si potrà realizzare il sogno che il premio Nobel Mohammed Yunus, proprio qui a Roma, di fronte agli studenti universitari che lo ascoltavano, ha raccontato di portare da sempre con sé. Eliminare la miseria e la fame dal mondo, far sì che l'ultimo posto dove si troveranno sia, come ha detto Yunus, un museo, il museo della povertà. Grazie.
Merci, Monsieur le maire. Monsieur le secrétaire général, Monsieur Kofi Annan, je m'adresse à vous avec respect, d'abord, parce que vous avez été un grand secrétaire général des Nations Unies, parce que prix Nobel de la paix, parce que parmi vos actions fameuses, vous êtes l'auteur du rapport sur les objectifs du millénaire, que finalement les gouvernements des Nations Unies ont adopté, et aussi, si vous me le permettez, avec affection, parce que vous êtes le secrétaire général qui avait ouvert la porte aux gouvernements locaux. Et je vous en remercie. À vous, monsieur le secrétaire général.
Merci beaucoup pour vos aimables paroles. Mr. Mayor and dear friends, it is a real pleasure to be amongst you this morning and to discuss very important issues affecting millions around the world in this historic city of Rome. I would first like to pay special tribute to the Mayor for hosting this event together with the United Cities and Local Governments Organization. We are gathered here today at a very critical moment. I'm sorry, I should have excused myself for sitting. I decided to sit for two reasons: to introduce an element of informality, but I also believe that with my gray hair, I have the right to sit if I choose to. Yeah, we stand at the midpoint of the global commitment to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, and we are here to take stock. 7.5 years ago, the MDGs enshrined the commitment of world leaders to achieve basic development goals in every country and every region of the world. Supported by all major development actors, the MDGs include targets to eradicate hunger and extreme poverty, provide universal basic education, reverse the spread of killer diseases, and provide access to clean water. The MDGs also express a commitment to global partnership of development between the rich and the poor. And it recognizes that we are all in the same, to some extent, in the same boat. We are responsible for each other's welfare. It also recognizes the interdependent worlds. In an interdependent world, poverty or oppression anywhere is a threat to prosperity and stability everywhere. Without a measure of solidarity, no society can be truly stable, and no one's prosperity can be truly secure. This applies to nations, limited communities, but increasingly to the integrated global economy that we live in today. It is not realistic to think that some can go on deriving great benefits and wealth from globalization, while billions of people are left in poverty and are excluded. We have to give our fellow human beings, not only within each nation, but in the global community, the voice, the opportunity, and the capability to share in and contribute to global prosperity. Global solidarity is necessary and is possible. We know that. Each of us must make the conscious commitment to redress inequalities both within and between countries. And that is why this midterm evaluation of progress towards the MDGs is so crucial. It allows us to identify where progress is being made, where the gaps remain, and to determine who should be doing what. 5 years after the MDGs were adopted, the G8 summit in Gleneagles provided another watershed. It secured the political commitment of the world's largest economies to the fight against poverty and set concrete targets to reduce debt and increase development assistance. Building on the UN summits in Johannesburg, Monterrey, and I would say New York, Gleneagles helped to reverse the decline of official development assistance, including precise commitments to tackle the special needs of Africa. Specifically, the G8 promised to more than double development assistance by 2010, to make trade work for Africa, to cancel 100% the multilateral debt of some of the poorest nations, to support universal primary education, and to get as near as possible to universal access to treatment for HIV/AIDS. While these promises alone will not be enough to make poverty history, they could mark the beginning of the end of the extreme poverty for millions of men, women, and children. So we have much to be proud of, but we cannot for a moment or a second be complacent. There's much, much more to be done. A foundation for development, one can say, has been laid, but we cannot stop there. With only 7.5 years to go before the 2015 target date, the prospects are mixed at best. There are many countries in Asia that may be able to lift millions out of poverty. In Africa, very few countries at this stage are on track to meet these targets. And on top of that, the recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have told us that Africa is already and will be even more the continent worst affected by global warming. So whilst the African countries are trying, the odds are very difficult indeed. I do not believe it's too late to turn the tide around. It is not an easy task. It will take focus, application, and sustained commitment. And it requires action on the part of all countries, both rich and poor, if we are going to meet this target. It requires developing countries to live up to the commitment that all states made to adopt comprehensive development strategies. Here I'm talking about the developing countries, to adopt comprehensive development strategies for reaching the MDGs. Equally vital is a commitment of the developed North and the emerging and the prosperous emerging economies to provide resources to enable the poorer developing countries to lead their own development processes. In essence, this vision of development is a compact between the two groups that we need to make sure works properly. At the last meeting in Germany, the G8 meeting, Ms. Merkel indicated to her colleagues that no new promises were needed. What was required was to honor the promises that had already been made. And I also chair a group called the Africa Progress Panel, which was set up to monitor the contributions from the G8 and from the African countries. It was a partnership. They were to improve governance, fight corruption, and the developed countries were to provide financial assistance through development assistance, cancellation of debt, and to work with us for better trade regime. But the record is not good. Apart from 2 countries, the other countries are behind. And I think Evelyn will give you more details on that.
Love to.
Yeah, the other countries are behind. And I think it is extremely important that we honor commitments that we make. We cannot, as powerful countries, as the leaders of the world, come together once a year with great fanfare and the cameras, throw around big figures, and then go home and forget it. I think it is extremely important that we become not only determined to honor these commitments, but put forward concrete plans for honoring them. For example, at the last G8 summit, a figure of $60 billion was put forward to fight HIV/AIDS and malaria. How is this $60 billion going to be dispersed? How is it going to be paid? In what installments? I think governments of the developing world will need to know which annual payments they are to expect to be able to plan to program them effectively and be able to tackle the challenges they face. So throwing 60 billion into the air without all these details is not always the most effective way to help these countries. And as we move forward, I think the group which I chair, which is made up of men like Michel Camdessu, Bob Rubin, Peter Egan, and Grassa Machel, Mandela's wife, Mohammed Yunus, Bob Geldof, and us, we are going to use our collective interest, influence and pressure to encourage these governments to honor their commitments, and periodically we will speak to the press, we will make judgments which we will share with civil society and governments to try and push the process forward. I think when I look back to what we have achieved, it is quite a lot. But we set the targets, and when the Millennium Development Goals were agreed in the UN General Assembly, I reminded the prime ministers and the presidents who were in the room that this agreement, the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals with a target date of 2015 is yours. It is not something you're going to vote on and leave to the Secretary General to implement. You have to implement it in your countries at the country level in partnership with the private sector, civil society, local authorities who play a very important role in these societies to get it done. So the challenge is there, is for the governments north and south to pool their efforts and make sure that this is done. If we do not make that sustained effort, and above all, if we do not take action to contain environmental degradation, all our plans may turn out to be a pipe dream. The environment is going to be the biggest constraint on our development and growth. And I think some countries have realized this. And of course, when we talk of development, we mean sustainable development. And last week, some of you indicated with another group, we launched what we call Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, trying to work with the African government, but above all with the African farmer, who's often a woman, to improve agricultural productivity and eventually ensure food security. You cannot eliminate poverty if people cannot feed themselves. And that is one of the basic things that we need to do. And I would also finally say that we need to work very hard to make Doha a success. It's still a struggle. It's still a struggle, but if we do not really make that effort and continue to live in a world where there's free movement of goods, services, but not people, and agriculture is subsidized, we are really treating the poorer countries in a rather unfair manner. Let me say that when as Secretary General, I said that the Millennium Development Goals would not be achieved in the United Nations, but as I have repeated, by each country. And you, as mayors and local governors, you are the vital link between people and the government. You are on the front lines in the fight against poverty and exclusion. And as the mayor said, more and more people are rushing to cities, putting pressure on the cities, some going into slums, and creating conditions which, if unattended to, can become catastrophic for all of us. It is anticipated that not too long from now, 50% of the world's population will be living in cities. just dream of that, how these mega cities are going to be controlled, how we are going to deal with the poor who are in slums. We have a program which we say we should try and lift about 100 million people out of slums. And it's not going to be an easy task, but you are at the front lines. And so let me urge all of us to maintain the energy and the inspiration to succeed in meeting the development goals. And you have a really, really important role to play. And to the mayors and local governors from developing countries who are also here with us, let me say this. You have a responsibility to take action within your own constituencies and ensure that the goals are delivered to local people where it matters. It is after all at the local level that safe drinking water is provided, that children are able to go to school. And it is at the local level that the goals will be achieved. So it's wonderful to see the partnership here today with a determination to work together to achieve these goals. Your solidarity with partners in developing countries is vital to ensure global opportunities are not wasted. But let me, Mr. Mayor, say that important commitments have been made in response to the call from the people. MDG, Millennium Development Goals, are goals which are understood by everybody, man, woman in the street. They understand education for their children, drinking water, and they want it. They are demanding it. And it is up to us to do whatever we can to deliver. We need results. I salute you for your continued efforts, Mr. Mayor, and your colleagues to fight poverty. And I urge you to continue to work together until the task is complete. You have a vital role to play, and I know you are determined to play it to help ensure that your leaders keep the promises they have made. And I mean leaders on both sides, North and South. And to help ensure that everyone, and not just the fortunate few, can live in dignity and hope and not despair. Thank you very much.
Alors, nous avons, je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, engagé notre organisation, l'organisation des maires et des présidents de région, des responsables, des leaders des gouvernements locaux, des territoires, dans la campagne du millénaire. Et je crois que ce n'est que justice de donner à Evelyn Hefkins, qui dirige cette campagne du millénaire avec beaucoup de passion, de nous rappeler tout ce que nous pouvons faire dans la campagne. À vous, Evelyn.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to speak standing up. Not only because then I'm shorter, but also because I want to pay tribute to several of you at this panel. To start with, of course, you, Mayor Veltroni, but also Elizabeth Gattu herself. Because the great news is that indeed 2 years ago in Beijing, local authorities had their own local government Millennium Declaration. And this was a tremendous breakthrough. And of course, we acknowledge it was 5 years later than the national governments, but it was not you local governments that was to blame for that. Because the problem at the United Nations, and let me be very clear about this, is they are represented by their national governments. And it's not our fault. They come at national government level. And it took quite some time before many national governments started to realize that indeed they can make beautiful declarations about the Millennium Development Goals, but unless local governments are involved, we will never achieve them. Because, as many of you said already, it is locally where the poor live. It is locally where they suffer exclusion, poverty. And it is locally where basic health, basic education has to be delivered. And the good news is that because of the Millennium Development Goals, more and more governments in developing countries got the point and start decentralizing and empowering the local level to help deliver that. The Millennium Development Goals have spurred refocus, reform in poor countries. And that is great, because let's never forget, it is poor countries' governments that have the primary responsibility to achieve these goals. They have to improve their policies, they have to improve governance, they have to put the policies in place in health and education. And the good news is that in many, many developing countries we see this type of refocus and reform. But we rich countries in Goal 8 acknowledge that the poorest countries simply cannot do it just by themselves. And that we have to be more helpful, not just with aid, but also by reforming the rules that govern international trade to allow poor countries to export their products to our rich consumer markets to lift themselves out of poverty. So these are the rich countries' responsibility. But many of us are actually shirking these responsibilities. And the problem that we have at the United Nations, and I hope my former boss doesn't blame me for saying this so bluntly, is that we create platforms for your governments to make fantastic speeches. You know, tear-jerking, beautiful promises. But then these folks get into the plane back home to business as usual. And Mr. Annan could never send the police to governments that make promises but don't live up to them. We live today still in a world of sovereign states. And it is only you, the citizens, and only your parliaments that can actually hold your governments to account. And this is where local authorities can make such a difference. And I'll shorten my speech seriously because everybody has this. The 8 ways, north and south, local authorities can be helpful. 8 ways in the north gives fantastic examples how work with local authorities have helped to galvanize mobilization of citizens to hold their government to account. And particularly in Italy, we've been working with so many of you I also see in this room. And you know, we talk in our office a little bit about the Italian paradox. There is no country where we are working with citizens, organizations, and local authorities where we have so much enthusiasm, awareness, highest in Europe by now, about the goals, mobilization, young generations, yesterday night, lots, hundreds and hundreds of students, wonderful. But then, that's one Italy. And then there's the other Italy. What is the government doing? And I was really pleased, Mayor Baltoni, that you actually pointed out the plain facts that indeed Italy, among rich countries, among the G8, is not really presently as yet in the front line. Now, this month we will hit this halfway mark between 2000, when the promises were made, and 2015, when they have to be achieved. And let's say the news is not only bad. I mean, some of us in the UN are always saying, oh my God, the glass is half empty. Let's, you know, the alarm clock again. There's a lot of good news. Actually, even in Africa, there are some of the poorest countries making great progress. But what is the secret of the success? This is where both parties lived up to their promises. Poorest countries improved their policies. They put their priorities right. And these countries in Africa did benefit because some donors are being helpful and are giving debt relief. So it is absolutely possible to achieve these goals. But if you compare the efforts between rich and poor countries, it's us, the rich countries, that are lagging more. We have done much less. And among the G8, it is actually Italy, who is one of the countries that is not doing what it promised. And, you know, this is not just yesterday, this has been a situation for some decades. And Mayor Veltroni made the point about the promise that Italy made 5 years ago. By 2006, spend 0.33 of her income on aid. The difference between that promise would have delivered and what Italy actually did is $2.5 billion. That's more than the world needs to get all these kids to school. $2.5 billion, just 1 year, 2006. So local authorities do a lot of initiatives with their peers in poor countries. And these are important because it does help, but it will never add up, however multiplied your initiatives with twin cities, to compensate for the tens of billions that your governments at the national level promised and are not delivering. But this is not only about a bag of money. This is also about aid effectiveness. And thank you, Stefano, because you made most of the points I want to make on that. Because there's no point in raising taxpayers' money to do something about development if you don't change the way you deliver it. And one of the points the former Secretary General made in his report, Enlarge Your Freedom, was please, donors, if you're generous, focus, don't be driven by your geopolitical agenda. Focus it on the poorest countries. Most G8 countries spend around half of their development budget on middle-income countries. And even in Italy, it's still 42%. These countries don't need your scarce aid resources to achieve the Millennium Goals. Second, a lot of rich countries say still, here are my dollars or euros, but you have to spend it on my goods and my services. And Patricia, I adore you that you announced that Italy would stop this bad practice. That's a great achievement. But the most important point on aid effectiveness, and the last point, is the point, Stefano, you made, the fragmentation. We have to realize we don't develop them, they develop themselves. We have to enable poor countries to take that responsibility and stop confusing them with all our own little hobbies. And it's not just 27 of us. You know, the average African countries, there are 100 donors only in the health sector. Imagine you're in charge of a health minister, as a health minister, and you have to understand each of the hobbies of these 100 donors and their procedures and their, for everything. And you have to wine and dine these ministers and heads of agencies all the time. You can't run your health sector. We have to get our act together. That's the most important reform. And again, Patricia Sentinelli has started moving on that. And I really call on all of you to strongly support these important reforms. So this is, things are moving. But the most important point, and I'm talking with Emma Bonino a little bit later today, trade. We Europeans created a system of supporting our agriculture that actually totally undermines poor farmers in poor countries. 2/3 of the world's poor live in rural areas, depend on agriculture. How can they lift themselves out of poverty as long as we rich countries continue systematically destroying the markets they depend on? We have to change that system. So that's the kind of things we must do. And indeed, Mr. Secretary General, for me you always be there. He appointed me. You are right, there were these beautiful promises made at Gleneagles. Good to remind ourselves of that. Because actually in Heiligendamm, the G8 didn't remind itself of it at all. They came with new initiatives and new smokescreen and fudging figures, of which we don't know where it comes from and when it comes. I am all for recycling, but not with aid pledges to the poorest people in the world. So these are basically the issues where we have to see action. And again, the only people that can effectively hold countries' governments to account is citizens and their elected representatives. And it is you local authorities that can help galvanize citizen action. And let me end by quoting Gandhi. The difference between what we do and what we're capable of doing would be sufficient to solve most of the world's problems. Now, fostering citizen action to hold government to account for just implementing what they promised time and time again is something that local authorities have proven to be perfectly capable of doing. So let's just go the extra mile and put an end to the Italian paradox. Thank you. In the year 2000, world leaders promised to put an end to poverty, to reverse the AIDS pandemic, to empower women, to reduce radically child mortality, maternal mortality, and achieve that all by the year 2015. Now in 2007, we're halfway. And the problem is that they are not all living up to what they're promised. These goals are achievable, but only if every government does what it tells the United Nations what it will do. So it's important for citizens to get aware of these issues and remind their governments about the promises they made, which means in Italy the need to live up to what it promised at the European Union and at the United Nations, to spend for development cooperation, to reform the way development cooperation is delivered, and Patricia Santinelli is doing a good job exactly in doing that, and also help to change the rules that govern international trade, to allow poor farmers in poor countries to lift themselves out of poverty by selling their product on our rich consumer markets.
In the recent G8 in Germany, human rights activists were very, very angry with the countries that were participating. What is your position regarding that?
Well, again, promises were made 2 years ago, 5 years ago. In Glen Eagles, beautiful promises, lofty promises. And then these same people come together in Heiligendamm in Germany, and they don't even repeat their promises. They come with less. And that was a true disappointment, because these were promises to Africa, promises to the world's poor. How can you break these? I was really disappointed. I mean, I'm all for recycling, but recycling your promises to the world's poor, I don't think is acceptable.
What do you think is going to happen in the next couple of years, if anything?
Sorry?
What do you think is going to happen in the next couple of years? Do you believe in the latest promises on behalf of the leaders?
Well, I mean, some of them say, let's close the gap between what we're promised and what we're really planning to do. At the end of the day, I only care about what's being done. And if that will mean, less promises, let's just look at what's going to happen. And I'm very happy that Kofi Annan is actually chairing this progress panel, which will have tremendous moral authority to call on the world to achieve the Millennium Development Goals.
Thank you.
Millennium is committed to raise awareness on the Millennium Development Goals. Millennium is committed to help developed countries in order to meet the goals, eradicate hunger and poverty. We will do this, we are doing this, and we will reinforce our commitment with concrete and real projects.
La conferenza di oggi è estremamente importante, da un lato perché consolida il ruolo di Roma come capitale della nuova frontiera della civiltà, che è quella della lotta contro la povertà per un mondo più giusto, per più dignità. In secondo luogo perché credo che il ruolo degli enti locali in particolare, che è un po' l'oggetto di questa conferenza, è stato per troppo tempo sottovalutato. Credo che poiché uno dei principali problemi nella lotta contro la povertà è quello dell'empowerment dei poveri e soprattutto di quelli che li rappresentano più vicini a loro, credo che la nuova frontiera sia davvero quella delle autorità locali nei paesi partner, nei paesi in via di sviluppo. E da questo punto di vista le esperienze europee, italiane ma europee in generale, sono decisive. Quindi credo che effettivamente costruire su un partenariato diretto tra le autorità locali dei paesi partner e le autorità locali in Europa sia effettivamente forse uno dei modi migliori per poter accelerare questo difficilissimo processo per raggiungere gli MDG.
Il senso della conferenza è importantissimo perché non possiamo stare inerti e la cosa più importante è collegare la salute umana e la possibilità di affrontare questa salute umana dando prospettive reali per il futuro con la salute degli ecosistemi del pianeta. Se non c'è salute e vitalità degli ecosistemi del pianeta è difficilissimo che ci possa essere salute umana.
Je suis Brigitte Kakoulou, maire de la commune d'Oumé et c'est en Côte d'Ivoire. Je pense que cette conférence est une conférence très importante parce que les objectifs du millénaire, comme on a dit, visent à déraciner la pauvreté et à créer un monde plus juste. Je pense qu'en tant que ressortissante d'un pays pauvre, je ne peux qu'adhérer à cela et appeler à un monde plus juste, un monde plus équilibré, c'est-à-dire tout simplement avoir accès aux services de base, l'eau, avoir accès à l'école et un juste commerce, une juste rémunération des produits agricoles de nos pays. Et surtout aussi l'accès aux marchés internationaux. Je vous remercie.
Je suis Charles-Henri Maléco, le directeur des relations internationales de la ville de Lyon. Lyon est très engagé dans la lutte pour réduire la pauvreté dans le monde et que les objectifs du millénaire soient atteints. Si nous continuons sur le rythme actuel, les objectifs de 2015 ne seront pas atteints en 2015 mais en 2050. C'est pour ça qu'il faut que les collectivités locales, les organisations internationales, les États travaillent tous ensemble avec les ONG également pour réduire la pauvreté dans le monde. Donc Lyon est très engagé dans ce combat. Lyon a beaucoup de villes dans le sud avec lesquelles nous travaillons, en Afrique noire, au Moyen-Orient. Et nous présidons la commission coopération décentralisée de CGLU, l'Assemblée mondiale des villes, pour que tout le monde prenne conscience de la nécessité d'agir ensemble pour réduire la pauvreté dans le monde. Eh bien, la route, c'est que tout le monde s'unisse. C'est-à-dire que les villes peuvent apporter ce qu'elles savent faire, c'est-à-dire l'assistance technique, la formation. Les problèmes qui se posent dans les villes du Sud sont les mêmes que ceux qui se posent dans les villes du Nord. Mais les villes du Nord ont pu résoudre ces problèmes. Donc nous pouvons apporter cette expérience. Mais nous avons besoin des financements des organisations internationales, de la Banque mondiale, de l'ONU. Et donc il faut que nous travaillions tous ensemble.
Yeah, it is very important that we have this title. Time is running out. Definitely time is running out because we are behind schedule. It is very important that every local authority comes on board so that we fulfill the promises we made about the Millennium Development Goals, because these goals are intended to improve the lives of our people. So it is very important that each local authorities comes on board and fulfill what we were supposed to fulfill. These 8 principles or promises we made about the goals of Millennium Development Goals are so important because they touch the lives of the people. And we leaders in the local authorities, we have the obligation to ensure that we fulfill them. So local authorities have a bigger role to play, and we have to do so in our local authorities. I am Stephen Kabuye, the mayor of Entebbe, Uganda, and also the vice chairman or the vice president of ICLE. ICLE is an international organization for sustainability. Yes.
Hello, I'm Richard Carey. I work at the OECD and I work for the Development Assistance Committee. That is the organization of donors who help developing countries to reach the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals are a set of goals that everybody can understand. People in developing countries, because that's really their way forward out of poverty, and people in the rich countries because they know what kinds of things their money is going to support. And having these goals has created a real international solidarity on development that wasn't there before, because now everybody understands in very concrete terms what the challenges are and how much progress is being made, where progress is not being made, where we need to know more. And action at the level of each village and each town is extremely important to make progress. And I think at this meeting of mayors from the developing world and from the OECD world is really important to get that real action for real people on the ground.
Mi nombre es Dionisio Marinco, soy el alcalde de Managua, en Nicaragua. Bueno, un saludo a la campaña de las metas del milenio. Nosotros en Nicaragua tenemos mucha esperanza de que se puedan lograr estos objetivos, aunque tenemos también escepticismo de que se pueda hacer todo, pero las necesidades son enormes y si no se une el mundo entero para resolver el problema de la pobreza, pues indiscutiblemente tendremos problemas nosotros y todo el mundo, de forma que es de interés común para todos resolver el problema. Yo creo que invirtiendo sobre educación, me parece a mí que la meta más importante sería mejorar la calidad educativa, levantar la calidad educativa, porque eso nos va a llevar después a mejorar el resto de las cosas.
This is really a great moment for the Millennium campaign globally, but particularly also in Italy. Having my former boss, Kofi Annan, coming here, actually celebrating the halfway mark between the year 2000, that the Millennium Development Goals were agreed, and the year 2015, when we must achieve them. And to hear this morning this tremendous commitment of several Italian leaders, like Walter Veltroni, Mayor of Rome, Patricia Sentinelli, the Secretary of State for Development, that Italy will go for it, was good to hear. Because it's really important that Italy starts to live up to the promises it made 7 years ago. Because poor countries need support from us, rich countries, to develop. And we should not just promise. We should actually do what we promise.